What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to the Bimmer barn. Today I'm going to be showing you how to replace the valve cover gaskets and timing cover gaskets on your N62. We have my BMW 550i today to do this job on, but the same procedure is going to apply on a ton of different cars powered by this motor, and I'm going to give you guys a detailed step-by-step guide so you can get your car leak-free at home as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get straight into the video. So in front of us we have all the parts that we're going to be changing today, including these spark plugs, and that's because it's just going to be so much more convenient to change them while we're in here. And the timing covers as well, I'm really going to recommend that if you're changing your valve cover gaskets, you go ahead and change the timing cover gaskets as well. So as usual, we're going to start by disconnecting the battery, and we're just going to go ahead and do that by the ground. I'll go ahead and flash the tools needed and sometimes the torque information in the upper left hand corner of the screen for you guys. So let me know if you enjoy that, and I'll go ahead and try to do it for all the future videos and DIYs on stuff like this. But then we're gonna go ahead and get under the hood now, and I'm gonna go ahead and put a link to the hood light that I use in case you guys need a good one. It's really useful. And yeah, let's go ahead and get to work on the motor. Now these plastic cowls here for the cabin filters, they have 13mm bolts on them, but they only need to be turned 90 degrees in order to unlock and remove these plastic pieces. And then once you've got these out of the way, you can go ahead and remove the support beam, which is held in by a few of these big Torx bolts. So we're going to start off on the passenger side, or the right valve cover as it's called in the service manual. And the first thing that you're going to want to do is remove the covers for the ignition coils, because these keep these things locked in place, and they're held in place by an E7 bolt. So we're going to go ahead and unscrew those to get them out of the way, and then we can get the ignition coils out of the way. Although we do run into a problem on the last cylinder because the AC line is actually in the way, but I'll show you guys how we can get around that. So what I'm doing right here is, you can see I removed the bolts for the bracket, and then I'm going to kind of just move it out of the way. Luckily you can kind of bend it softly. It's made out of a flexible hose, and that gives us enough room to get the ignition coil out of the way. The other three are really easy to get out of the way, and we're just going to set them aside on the E-box here and get to work on the PCV valve. So I'm using a flathead here to just pry off the connectors for the system, and that's going to make it a little bit easier than trying to squeeze. And then we're going to go ahead and remove these brackets here that hold down the covers for the harness, because we just want to have a little bit more looseness around the valve cover as we're going to try to wrestle this thing out of the car. Now you've also got these three sensors on the top of the valve cover that you have to disconnect, and the electrical plugs are pretty easy. You just kind of pull on them. Hopefully you don't yank too hard and break the cables. But I would recommend to grab the seals for these sensors so that you can replace them while your valve cover is out, and it's really easy. I did not get the opportunity to do that this time around, but I'm going to go ahead and put the part numbers for all of the possible while you're in there parts in the description below, and that way you guys have access to those. Now as you saw, I just pulled out the valve motor. It is under a little bit of tension, but if you're careful enough, it's not gonna, fly out anywhere. And then we need to remove the spacer that's right underneath it, and it's gonna be a little bit tricky installing this later, at least the spacer is, but the motor is real easy because all you have to do is spin it into the valve cover and it goes in real easy. Actually, you can see that the seal on this one had some corrosion built up on it, and that tells me that it wasn't 100% sealed before. But anyways, now we can go ahead and get the coolant reservoir out of the way, as well as the power steering reservoir, and both of these are just going to give us a little bit more room, so when we get the valve cover loose and try to get it out, we'll be able to get it out successfully. Now the 10mm bolts for the valve cover can be in pretty tight spots, so I used a combination of a 10mm flex head wrench and also a 10mm socket on a swivel extension, and that was enough to get access to all the bolts. Now, even with all the bolts loose, you'll probably have to use a pry bar like I did to get the valve cover loose and lift it off of these spark plug tubes, which kind of hold it down. And then you'll see that I had to remove the E-box cover to loosen up the main harness enough to get the valve cover completely out. And that's actually something that it says in the service manual as well. So something to keep in mind is, again, it's pretty tight. You're going to have to loosen a lot of things around the valve cover just to get it out. And here you can see the oil spillage on the bottom of the subframe and all that. It was just a big mess. So we're gonna go ahead and pull out this valve cover gasket, the old one, trash it, and continue with removing the timing cover gasket, which is done by removing the vacuum pump first, and then we have to remove the Vano solenoids, and then we'll be able to get the timing cover off. Also, a little tip to get hose clamps like this off of the vacuum pump hose. I like to use a 1/4" drive socket, and that just fits on the hose clamp perfectly, so you don't have to use a flathead. Just a little trick. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to the Vano solenoids. These have a little 10mm bolt holding the bracket onto the back of them, and then when you also get the connectors disconnected off of them, they'll kind of be stuck in still, so you'll probably have to use a pry bar like me to slowly and gently pry them out, and that way you can go ahead and remove the timing cover. Now I know I'm going to get roasted for not replacing the spark plug tubes down in the comments below, but I figure I'll go ahead and give you guys the part number for these things so you can replace them. They are recommended in the service manual to do while you're doing the valve cover gasket, but unfortunately I didn't have them available in time for this video. So now while the valve cover is off, I'm going to go ahead and change the spark plugs just because we've got plenty of room here in the engine bay to get our socket around. And these ones had not been serviced in a long time, so I'm certain that the car is going to run a ton better, a ton cleaner. There was just a ton of corrosion on the old spark plugs, as you'll see in a second. So now that that's all taken care of, I'm going to go ahead and use a microfiber towel to really clean the surface of the cylinder head before we install the valve cover. And you'll also see me cleaning the valve cover with some brake cleaner, and that's just to get the oil out of the channels where we're going to be installing our new gasket in a second. That way it doesn't slip out when we're physically placing the valve cover onto the cylinder head. The valve cover also has these rubber washers that are a part of the bolts in the front and then one in the back. It also comes in the kit with replacement washers for the nuts that are going to be used in the valve cover, which you actually have to reuse. So just something to keep in mind here. Don't go throwing away those hardware pieces because you might have to reuse some of them. Now you're also going to need some RTV for this job because here in the corners of the gasket you have to add a little bit of RTV to help make a seal, and then also where the timing cover meets the cylinder head you're going to have to add some RTV because that gasket for the timing cover is not perfectly flat. And then once you've gone and done that, you're ready to install the valve cover. Now when you're replacing these rubber gaskets for the nuts that go on the valve cover, you should notice that there are two different lengths, and you'll find that the shorter ones are supposed to go on the bottom of the valve cover, whereas the longer nuts are supposed to go on the top side. And specifically the ones that have threaded inserts like this, those are supposed to go around the Valvetronic motor because you're going to use those to supply a ground to the injectors and to the Valvetronic harness and all that. So just something to keep in mind. These are torqued down to 10 Newton meters, and once you got them all installed, it's basically just a matter of reinstalling everything you removed a minute ago. So once you get this adapter plate installed, I kind of forgot to videotape this, or I think the battery died on my camera, but you're going to install the Valvetronic motor by just placing it into that adapter and then spinning it clockwise, which is just going to thread it into the eccentric shaft, and it'll be flattened out with the spacer, and then you can install those bolts. Now moving on to the driver's side of the car, or the left cylinder head cover, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. There's a few things in the way of the valve cover as well as the timing cover that are going to be annoying to remove, but you're going to have to deal with it to get this valve cover replaced. And I figure if you're going to do one side, you might as well do both, because what are the chances that the other one's not going to leak soon anyways. So the first thing that we have to deal with is the purge canister valve, and that's right here. So I disconnected the harness for it first, and then the hoses on either end. One goes to the throttle body, one goes to the hose in the back of the car, and then we go ahead and pull that out. And then the bracket itself is held on by a 10mm bolt to the timing cover. So we want to remove the bracket, and then I like to put the bolt back in so that we don't lose track of it and we know exactly where it goes. Now with that fuel line out of the way, I focused on getting the ignition coils out, and I noticed that although I could get the first 3 ignition coils out, the last one again had something in the way. So what I had to do here was I had to remove the 10mm nut that holds the plastic cover on this red battery cable, and with that out of the way, I could move the battery cable to the side, and then I could slip the ignition coil out. That was the only way I could find to get this thing out, but hey, you gotta do what you gotta do. Now here I was removing all the bolts from the valve cover on this side, and I thought I was almost there. I was going to get this thing out, and then I realized that I just couldn't get it out. I just didn't have enough room really. And after checking the service manual, I realized that this AC duct here on the firewall has to be removed first. So there's one bolt and a few on the sides here that you have to loosen, remove, and then there's actually a 10mm screw in the very center. I honestly couldn't reach it. I'm not sure if I messed it up, but if you can, you want to turn it 90 degrees. I wasn't able to, but I was still able to get the whole thing out. But as you'll see, there's also a water pipe that's held onto it on this side by a 4mm Allen on like a little clamp. Depending on which air conditioning version you had, you might have to worry about it, you might not. But anyways, yeah, go ahead and get this out of the way so that you can get your valve cover on the driver's side of the car up and out. And hey, if I had done this in the beginning, maybe the passenger side would have been easier as well. And one more thing that I did differently on this side was because of the fuel rail and the way that the fuel line comes off on this side, I went ahead and removed the 2 screws that hold it onto the intake manifold, and that way I could push it away from the valve cover as I removed it, and that just gave me the little extra room that I needed. Now with the Vano solenoids out of the way, we can move on to removing the timing cover, and the problem is here that you have to remove, or at least get the alternator out of the way in order to remove one of the bolts for the timing cover. So that just means removing tension from the belt so you can slip the top bolt out of the alternator, as you can see right here, and the bottom bolt, just loosening it, lets the alternator slip out of the way, and then I'm able to put an extension on the E8 torque socket to get that particular corner bolt for the timing cover. So the rest of them are pretty easy to slip around with an extension or with the socket, and then you're able to remove the timing cover itself. So a little bit more tricky on this side. There's hoses in the way, so you kind of have to get creative with your extensions, but once you get it off, it's going to be worth it. Oh, and if you're wondering how to remove the alternator, I'm going to have a video on replacing the alternator plate gasket pretty soon, so subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for that upcoming video. Now I'm going to share with you one of the sneakiest tricks that I've used for years now when installing gaskets on BMWs, and that is using a dab of super glue on the valve cover gasket itself to keep it inside of this little channel here, because the last thing that you want is for this thing to fall out as you're placing it on the cylinder head. So just enough glue to keep it stuck in. Doesn't take a long time to dry. You're going to go ahead and have to put RTV on the gasket and on the cylinder head itself anyways, so get that done in the meantime. But it's just going to help you make sure that the gasket doesn't fall out of the valve cover as you're laying it on, and you want to make sure it doesn't get caught on anything either, because that's definitely going to rip it out. So don't use anything else besides super glue though. You don't want to use anything that's like expanding Gorilla Glue or anything that's going to keep the gasket from sitting right like RTV, but a little bit of super glue goes a long way, guys. Also, take time to inspect the valve cover and make sure that the gasket is seated and even as much as possible, especially with like a little pocket mirror. A great way to check, and just make sure before you start reinstalling everything that you have the gasket seated correctly. Now a couple more final tips as we finish up the job here. The Vano solenoids in the front of the timing cover, they can definitely be a pain to install. What I've noticed is you probably want to try to put the O-ring into the timing cover first, make sure it's really nice and clean, and then put the solenoid in. Try to twist it as it goes in, but I ended up using a pry bar and a little bit of hammer to get it fully in there, seated well, because you want to make sure it's fully seated. And then the Valvetronic motor, remember I said you can install that just by twisting it into the head here, and when you start the car the first time, it actually automatically senses and recalibrates those motors. So that's taken care of for you. Remember to reinstall your alternator back in the correct position, and then get the AC duct in the back and just start reinstalling everything. Generally, I would recommend starting up the car before getting everything like the cabin filter covers and the engine covers in place, just because you want to have access to see everything in case you did mess up with seating the valve cover, which happens. So go ahead and get the car kind of squared away where you can start it safely with the intake and the mass airflow sensor hooked up and all that, and then give it a test start, make sure it's all good to go, and then you can go ahead and finish up with all the aesthetic little pieces in the engine bay. So I wish you guys a ton of luck Remember to be safe and take your time doing this job. And hopefully now you can do this at home yourself and save yourself a ton of money instead of paying a shop to do it. So that's going to conclude our video for today, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching. If this video helped you change your valve cover on your 550i or 545i or N62 powered car, be sure to leave a like down below and comment if you have any other questions. I might be able to answer them, or someone else watching the video might see your comment and answer it for you. And subscribe to the channel if you're new and you haven't yet. As always, I hope everyone has an amazing day, and we will see you in the next video.